Hello and welcome to In Focus. I'm Peter Laffin, senior editor at the Washington Examiner, and my guest today is Greg Lukianoff, president of FIRE, the Foundation of Individual Rights and Expression, and co-author of the highly influential book, The Coddling of the American Mind. Greg, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
So we care deeply about the cause of free speech at the Washington Examiner, and you've become something like the central defender of free speech nationally, not only through your work at FIRE, but also through, you're always in the media on podcasts like this one, and essays are in major publications. And so I wonder, is this how you saw your career shaping up?
Well, I mean, I have like three different answers for that. First one is my ambition as a kid wasn't very great. I kind of just figured, looking at the model of my dad and my family, that everybody was always economically struggling in every situation, that people rarely got to actually do what they dreamed about. Even in my like fantasies about being successful one day, I was still like struggling to, my biggest fantasies as a kid was having a struggling comic book company, but when I started getting focused on the First Amendment, the answer part two is simply that I focused on it like an arrow. Like I went to law school to do First Amendment law. I took every class that Stanford offered on First Amendment law until I ran out. Then I did 6 credits on censorship in the Tudor dynasty. I interned at the ACLU of Northern California. I designed those 6 credits myself, by the way. And so this was what I wanted to do with my life. I didn't end up in this position by any means by accident. However, if you were to tell me that FIRE would be as prominent as it is, the funny thing is, if you put it to me as FIRE would be as prominent as it is, I'd say yes. If you told me that I'd be in the middle of such big things like this, I'd be probably a little more skeptical out of a kind of like a deep-seated humility on and kind of humble, expectations of my life. But here's the problem, though, ultimately. One of the reasons why we are prominent, and one of the reasons why a lot of people are asking my opinion a lot, is because we are in trouble when it comes to free speech at the moment. So I would have loved to have a career where things were so well protected that my cases were edge cases all the time. But now I feel like I'm protecting, we've become so much more important because we have to protect speech that we would have taken for granted was protected, and it usually is protected under the First Amendment, but it's still under threat.
So, like many conservatives, I became aware of your work through The Coddling of the American Mind that you co-wrote with Jonathan Haidt. And at the time, this was, maybe a decade ago or coming up on a decade ago, I was still a high school English teacher. That was my main gig. I was writing on the side, but I was teaching. And I noticed, well, something is happening to my students. I can't put my finger on it. I don't have the language for it. And when I read your book, it connected a lot of dots for me. And you identify these 3 sort of bad ideas that were harming this generation. I wonder, for our audience, if you could just briefly tell us what those were.
Sure. Yeah. So basically, the idea was when we were working on the book, Haidt and I got sort of pulled down into a big sort of ditch of intersectionality and philosophy of what was going on campus, and I concluded we were starting to write a book I didn't want to read. So I proposed the idea of like having negative advice, like we given the Lukianoff family, where it's basically like, listen, you're not going to listen to my specific advice, but maybe at least you'll listen to what I'm going to tell you not to do in life. And so we came up with this idea of the 3 great untruths, which is essentially things that don't agree with ancient wisdom or modern psychology, and we assert will make you miserable if you believe them. And those 3 beliefs are: what doesn't kill you makes you weaker, the opposite of what Nietzsche said, about what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That essentially, which is just terrible advice to give to someone, like the idea that challenges will just destroy you as opposed to potentially lead you to thriving and make you feel strong in future challenges. 2, which is the one that sounds the nicest and is all over Hollywood movies, is always trust your feelings, which sounds so good. But it's terrible advice to give somebody, because your feelings, I was proud of myself for boiling this down to a paragraph explanation. And then I read something by Susan David where she said, your feelings are data, not directions. And I was like, fine, like you did that so much better than me. That's awesome. And that's essentially what it is. Sometimes you feel angry. Like I always point out that I feel when I get the most angry, it's usually because I'm angry at myself deeply. That's what's really going on. Sometimes you feel sad because you're jealous. But sometimes you feel, jealous because you're angry. Like your feelings aren't always telling you precisely what you think your feelings are telling you. So you have to interrogate them, and that's why wisdom traditions are, and oftentimes involve a lot of stepping back from your feelings, whether it's Buddhist or Stoic thought, for example, two of my favorite kind of areas of thinking. And what we felt like was going on campus was students were being taught what's called in cognitive behavioral therapy emotional reasoning. That if I'm upset right now, this is someone else's fault and something has to be done about it right now. And number three, the one that we have in spades at the moment is life is a battle between good people and evil people.
Mm.
And I grew up at a time when that kind of binary thinking was increasingly considered unsophisticated, kind of backwards a little bit. And I felt like we were heading towards this kind of like greater moral sophistication of humanity. And instead, I feel like we got back to a hyper simplistic good versus evil dichotomy. And you see this both on the right and the left, where it's like people aren't shades
Right.
of gray. They were a good zero or a bad one.
Yeah, on the right or the wrong side of history. The
Yeah,
left might
yeah.
have said a decade ago when you were writing this book.
Freaking Hegelians, they ruin everything.
What this all amounts to, though, with those three ideas, what it amounts to is people are suddenly hostile to speech.
Yeah,
You can see why hostility to speech would be born of those bad ideas.
absolutely.
So you wrote this a decade ago, and
Mhm.
our audience is familiar with what was going on campus then. We wonder, is this mindset still predominant in our classrooms at the high school level and the university level?
The fragility argument is probably the one that's gotten, I hesitate to say better the most. Like the what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. It's more like it's been sidelined because the fragility argument was basically like, don't point out that someone's overweight because like that will lead them to kill themselves. Like like basically the idea that kind of like you could hear like an insult even directed at someone else and suddenly like that's you'll never recover. You have PTSD for that forever. There's been less of that, but for a very pernicious reason. The post October 6th style protests have a much harder, nastier edge that doesn't give a damn about anyone's fragility. But it's like they replaced Great Untruth number one with a hyper version of Great Untruth number three, which is essentially like if you're against me, you're pro genocide, you're a monster. I can stop you by any means necessary, as Shaun White, for example, just argued about, in relationship to the Bondi Beach massacre. Hopefully he said it before the Bondi Beach massacre, but essentially that like, if you're Israeli, you're a legitimate target, which is just monstrous thing to say. So I do think that things have shifted. I can't really say they've improved.
Yeah, I think I heard someone say of this generation of college students, they're leaving their class on microaggressions and they're going out to the Kill the Jews rally. It's really disconnected.
Yeah,
In one area they're very sensitive, in another area that mask is totally thrown off. Um,
absolutely.
so, your organization puts out these college rankings now every year
Mm.
on how the campuses are doing on free speech. Since Trump was inaugurated and sort of started this war between the administration and these colleges, have you seen any shifts in the free speech rankings? Did anything surprise you? Say, like, I know I've read a couple times in your rankings in the past, like Columbia is dead last. Is there
Yeah.
any improvement on those campuses that were doing really, really bad?
Some of them, absolutely. I've impressed with how much the campus free speech ranking has been a positive force for reform in higher ed. So Harvard, for example, was dead last 2 years in a row in our ranking, and believe me, it earned it. It's a very meticulous, rigorous ranking that we do. It's the biggest database of student opinion on the free speech climate, the biggest database of professor cancellations, student cancellations, deplatforming, and speech codes. And we put them all together with a variety of weights, and they really came in dead last. Harvard is trying to improve itself, but I would say overall the Ivy League's not doing great. They're still uniquely bad, but there's significant improvement in one outlier among the Ivy League, which is Dartmouth. Dartmouth has been working very hard to make their school better for viewpoint diversity, for disagreement, and it's showing in the stats, for example. Mm-hmm. And in terms of schools that have improved, Claremont McKenna is number one again, and that was very intentional. UVA worked really hard to be a better school and was number one last year. So it is having a positive effect. The concern that I have, though, is that on some campuses, and Claudine Gay just totally represented this in a recent talk over the past couple of days, basically saying that the Trump backlash is the worst thing, and more or less kind of implying that, or even saying directly that it came from nowhere and it was just a moral panic and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, yeah, when Trump goes overboard in his attempts, fire is there to oppose him. We oppose people on the basis of censorship, whether on the right or the left. But the idea that campuses didn't sort of sleepwalk their way into this is complete nonsense. And they still would like to shift the discussion so they don't have to change or fix anything and just, keep things 2021 forever.
So on these campuses that did improve, Claremont, McKenna, UVA, what changed that got the rankings to get bumped up?
It's always, most importantly, leadership. It doesn't necessarily mean that the leadership literally changed. Sometimes it can be a president who was okay on these issues, but then decided to really commit. But at Dartmouth, for example, which I've mentioned already, it's Siam Baylock. I always pronounce her name wrong, and I feel bad as someone who has a hard to pronounce name myself. Siam Baylock, and she really has, put effort into having opportunities for people to talk across lines of difference, to teach people about freedom of speech. So leadership is ultimately what matters, and the willingness to make some hard decisions, to make some real reforms.
Well, I imagine there's student pushback to those reforms and those changes, because the ideas that created the hostility to free speech must be so deeply ingrained at this point. Are they seeing like strife on campus of the students protesting and saying we want less free speech?
Sometimes, that has been one of the weirdest things about the whole kind of like post woke and woke era, is basically having student activists who, unlike the activists of the 60s, are saying, activists of the 60s were saying, leave us alone, treat us like adults. And the activists of 2012 was, power needs more power to protect me. Or actually, more accurately, power needs more power to protect them, because I speak for some person or group that is weaker than me and can't actually live with freedom. But oftentimes, like, in a way that is just exercising power as power has always done.
So I wonder if you might compare the state of free speech in America today under Trump with the challenges that free speech faced under Biden. We know there's been some controversy around Jimmy Kimmel. There was the flag burning executive order. How would you compare the two administrations? And do you think that free speech is more or less protected today than it was 2 or 3 years ago?
So the Biden administration, the difficulty of evaluating the Biden administration versus the Trump administration is that, given that the major U.S. institutions are already hard left-leaning in many cases, whether that's academia or most of the mainstream media, or even things like law firms, like they're. And by hard left, I mean like overwhelmingly like left-leaning, is that in that case, you have the luxury of being like, well, I just have to make sure that people don't change that. Whereas if you actually want to reform those institutions, you have to be more activist about it. So the worst thing the Biden administration did was allow academia to get so much worse, in some ways encouraging it through a variety of ways. It also, censored people online through what's a process called jawboning, which is essentially using executive power and influence to get websites and social media platforms to censor speech the president himself wouldn't be forbidden from censoring directly under the First Amendment, but making people do sort of his dirty work for him. And that's definitely the biggest act of commission as opposed to omission that the Biden administration did. I will say, flat out, and I'm sure some of your listeners won't like this, the Trump administration has been worse. What we've seen coming out of the Trump administration, to be clear, I want better journalism, and I think there's ways to get there that don't involve federal coercion. I do think that calling out some of the things that law firms are doing is totally fine. Telling your enemy law firms that they can't enter federal buildings or they will lose their security clearance is not fine. Just because they've opposed the government or opposed the Trump administration in the past, that's nuts. And even when it comes to higher ed, we're in the weird position of defending Harvard because I'm no fan of Harvard. But instead of actually saying, and this is what drives me nuts, is there were ways to make a lot of this better. Like that actually would have been perfectly constitutional. For example, like there's ways you could have addressed the role of administrators, the way you could have addressed the skyrocketing costs. There's ways you could have there are things that the administration could have done that were perfectly constitutional, but instead, when it came to a place like Harvard, they sent a letter more or less saying that, well, because we think you have problems with anti-Semitism, here's our settlement offer. And our settlement offer is now the federal government gets to control admissions, curriculum, hiring. And it's like, are you trying to federalize Harvard? So the way the Trump administration has been going about addressing problems that I recognize are real, and I've been leading the fight explaining that they are real, has been a mess that has resulted in more censorship.
It was my impression that they started out pretty strong. There was that executive order on free speech, and then it slowly started to get worse. But then when the Charlie Kirk assassination happened, it was my impression that there was a change in tone and in policy. Is that how you saw it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The Charlie Kirk assassination was horrible, to be clear. And as far as and I've written actually a fair amount about how frightened I am for so many of my friends who are, maybe less controversial than Charlie Kirk, but nonetheless, have good reason to be scared. Everyone from, Jesse Signal to Barry Weiss. But the Trump administration used this as an excuse, as it always does, to go after its political enemies. And I mean, one of the worst cases I've seen in my entire career, if not the worst, and this wasn't the Trump administration, at least not directly, but certainly, given how many people the Trump administration targeted for saying insensitive things about the death of Charlie Kirk, it opened the doors for it, was a ex-cop in Tennessee was arrested for a meme really critical of Trump more than anything else. So there was supposed to be a memorial for Charlie Kirk, and there was a little listserv that got sent to. And this ex-cop responds with a quote and a picture of Trump saying, "We have to get over it," in response to a school shooting a couple of years ago, and said, "Seems appropriate now." And more or less what he was trying to do was call out what he perceived as Trump's callousness about a previous shooting and saying well, I'm just being just as callous then. You can say you can call it obnoxious or whatever, but certainly unquestionably protected. The local sheriff claimed that because the Trump quote was in response to a school called Perry High School in several states away, that was somehow a threat to Perry County High School in Tennessee, which not even the people who went to Perry County High School believed was a threat to that school. And he was held for 37 days and a $2 million bond for something that was clearly protected speech. You have to go back to the 1920s to see something that bad. So it's rough days around, and it didn't have to be for any of this stuff. You could have actually gotten you could have gotten meaningful, sustainable reform in a lot of ways without violating the Constitution. But some days I just don't know what they're thinking.
What was your reaction to the JD Vance Munich speech? and how that maybe informs how you view him. Obviously, many people think of him as the heir to the Republican Party.
Mm.
His Munich speech and maybe his action since then. Do you think he's going to be a strong defender of free speech?
I hope so. The Munich speech was correct. Like what's going on in the European Union and in the UK in terms of free speech is a disaster. Is a true terrifying disaster. Like people going to jail for insulting their rapist more for more time than the rapist gets is nuts. Arresting a playwright at the airport because of some tweets criticizing trans rights activists. It's like I'm working on a piece, and like the only thing that's slowing me down is just the torrent of cases that are like this coming out of the EU and the UK. So Vance was entirely right to be critical of the EU and of the UK. So that I had no problem saying. I just wish that it becomes harder to make those criticisms, though, when we come back and in our own backyard, we're not being as principled about free speech as we're supposed to be, as we're known to be in other cases. So I very much agree with the sentiment. I'm very worried about what's going on in the UK and Britain. I just want to make sure that we follow those same rules here.
Yeah. What's next for you in Fire?
Hopefully, I get to take a nap. Is probably the thing I'm the most excited about today. I wanted this year, I had three additional priorities. One was to do more tech work. I'm very concerned about regulations' ability to harm input and output of artificial intelligence in a way that would allow the same people who screwed up knowledge creation in higher ed to control essentially what is deemed objectively true by AI. That keeps me up at night. It scares me so much. And we're fighting there, and that's a big tough battle that people don't oftentimes even understand. So that's part of it. Part two was to actually increase awareness of the international situation. And I am thankful to JD Vance for helping us make sure that more people knew. I'm actually, interestingly enough, thankful to 660 Minutes for running a piece about German censorship of what would be protected speech in the United States, because it was just nuts. But three is higher education reform. And I don't necessarily want Fire to be like going in and, like lobbying for a lot of this stuff, but essentially having a really clear roadmap schools can follow to make their schools better. And because I think about this stuff all the time. But I mean, I would say this year was a very challenging year. It's tough to raise money as a principled organization,
Right.
because, there are genuinely principled First Amendment people, and then there are a lot of people who will give you money if they like what side you're attacking or defending.
Right.
And if that switches, they don't like you anymore, and that's predictable. And expected, but also heartbreaking in its own way, because
Yeah.
we're Americans, damn it. We're supposed to believe in free speech for everybody.
Yeah. I can't imagine it's a line of work where you make a lot of friends and keep them.
It's tough. It's tough. The friends that I've been able to keep, and I have lost friends, to be clear. The friends I've been able to keep are ones who appreciate the principle.
Well, we appreciate the principle. We appreciate your time today, and please keep us informed of what you're up to and come back and see us again.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Okay.